Critics and commentators within the entertainment industry have used a bevy of grandiose adjectives to describe the directorial career of Sir Ridley Scott. Words such as legendary, genius, master have been thrown about alongside claims that he is one of the greatest directors to have ever taken up the chair. The Wikipedia article on Sir Ridley also states in its third sentence that he is one of the highest-grossing directors of all time. However, the reality of Ridley Scott's career as a film director is a bit more complicated than the bombastic language often used to describe his legacy. Furthermore, any argument to his status amongst the highest-grossing directors fails to account for several factors that might make that accolade seem a lot less impressive, such as the profit margins of his films or even just looking at the cumulative production budget of his films compared to his overall gross. Ridley Scott's career as a director spans nearly 50 years. Beginning with The Duelists in 1977 up to Gladiator II in 2025, Scott has directed a total of 29 feature films. The question that often arises, though, when one looks through his backlog of work is, does the work of Ridley Scott live up to the status he is often afforded? Now, if one wishes, they could jaunt over to Google and type in Ridley Scott's films ranked, and you will be rewarded with an absolute onslaught of results from a wide range of websites. I myself attempted to read through a few of these, and the problem I continued to encounter was that none of the articles made it explicitly clear by what criteria they were ranking the films. One is left to assume the sole criteria was objective quality, but the subsequent analysis that accompanies each film in these rankings was nothing more than a bland retelling of the plot, as if that suffices as an objective critique of the quality of the film. Thus, I wanted to write a review ranking Ridley Scott's feature films where the ranking criteria was explicit from the outset and provide the accompanying data by which I reached my conclusions. Thus, with the exception of The Duelists, which had to be excluded due to a lack of data, this review will attempt to analyze the best and worst of Ridley Scott's backlog as a feature film director based on the following 4 criteria. The first criteria will be Scott's best and worst films according to critics. The second will be a ranking of his films according to audiences. The third will be his films ranked by profit margin. And the final criteria will be a ranking of his films based on estimated domestic ticket sales. Therefore, the first 4 parts of this review will deal with each of these criteria in turn. In part 5 of the review, I will then present a bottom 5 worst of the worst, which will be based on each film's average position within the 4 aforementioned criteria. And part 6 will do the same, only with the best of the best. Finally, in part 7, I will offer my closing thoughts and summarizing analysis on what I think all the data says about Ridley Scott's career as a feature film director. Now, one last thing before we begin. I want to make something abundantly clear. First, these lists are a ranking based solely on the criteria I just laid out, and the basis for each will be detailed at the outset of each individual part. Second, none of the criteria I am using is meant to be a proxy for objective quality. Alright, so with all that said,
in the face of overwhelming odds, I'm left with only one option. I'm gonna have to science the shit out of this.
Part 1. Ridley Scott's best and worst films according to critics. The data in this section will be based on the average review scores for Ridley Scott's films taken from 2 major review sites, Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic. I chose to average the 2 scores for each film because there does tend to be a difference in the scores for each site, and rather than attempting to bias toward one or the other, I felt it more balanced to include both. Interestingly, the average critic score across all of Ridley Scott's films for both sites was actually the same, 63%. In other words, the combined average critic score on Rotten Tomatoes for the 28 feature films Ridley Scott has directed is 63%, and the combined average critic score on Metacritic is also 63%. Thus, there does seem to be some consistency in that regard. So what does 63% mean? I spoke about this in my Deadpool 2 review as well, but what's most important to understand is that this percentage is not a representation of the review scores out of 10. In other words, 63% does not mean that the average review score for Ridley Scott's films according to the critic reviews from Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic was 6.3 out of 10. No. What is more accurate is to say that there is a 63% chance that the average reviewer will find Ridley Scott's films above average. In other words, 63% of the time, critics tend to rate Scott's films at least 5.6 out of 10. I think it's fair to say that that rating doesn't seem to fit with a director so often lauded as a legendary genius. That said, let's take a look at his 3 lowest rated films according to critics first. A quick reminder here that The Duelists was removed from the analysis, so we are only covering 28 of his 29 feature films. So coming in at number 26, we have 1492, Conquest of Paradise, with an average critical response of 39%. 1492 was a historical epic produced and directed by Ridley Scott about Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World. This film was released in 1992 and starred Gerard Depardieu, or however the heck you say that guy's name, as Christopher Columbus, Armand Assante as Columbus's rival, and Sigourney Weaver as Queen Isabella I. The film was originally financed independently, and Scott was able to raise $47 million to make it. Then he eventually sold the rights to Paramount for $10 million, and it made around $7 million domestically. This led to an interesting interview question with Total Film from 2021, where Scott had this to say about the movie. Ridley Scott: Gerard is fantastic. His French accent, I don't think it got in the way at all, because I understood exactly what he was doing. But the studio were going, yeah, we can't understand him. The British ear, did you have any problem understanding it? Total Film: no. Ridley Scott: no. In America, they're not used to different accents. They don't hear shit unless it's from Texas or America, right? Or North Carolina. In Europe, we are used to accents, and so Gerard's accent never bothered me at all. It's one of my favorite films. What's interesting, they don't know how to release it in America. Scott went on to argue that the film made $57 million internationally, but there are no records that I could find that support that claim. The film received negative reviews from critics, not based on the accents, but based on a problem that seems to have plagued much of Ridley Scott's career in making historical epics, and that, well, it was incredibly inaccurate, historically. The critical consensus from Rotten Tomatoes reads, historically inaccurate and dramatically inert. Ridley Scott's retelling of Christopher Columbus's exploits is an epic without grandeur or insight. If one looks into Scott's response to criticisms of Napoleon, I think you will find that his general reaction to criticisms of historical inaccuracies is something along the lines of, "Were you there?" Truly a legendary response. Moving on to number 27 on the list, we have A Good Year, a 2006 romantic comedy starring Russell Crowe, Albert Finney, and Marion Cotillard, with an average critical response of 37%. This was the second of 5 feature films that Ridley Scott and Russell Crowe collaborated on, and perhaps their biggest critical and financial failure. The film is a generic romantic comedy, with Crowe playing the boy who spent his childhood growing up in a rural area, France, for this particular movie, only to grow into a stuffy businessman who is forced back to his childhood countryside to discover love with the girl he knew when he was young. The critical consensus from Rotten Tomatoes sums it up like this: A Good Year is a fine example of top-notch director and actor out of their elements, in a sappy romantic comedy lacking in charm and humor. There is a quote from Ridley Scott's IMDb page where he once again had a pithy response to the criticism. I think Russell Crowe did brilliantly in A Good Year. He and I loved that film, and Fox loved it, and then they didn't know what to do, and we got beaten up. Russell got beaten up mercilessly, which I thought was disgraceful because I genuinely thought we had done a good movie about a man in transition, which is also quite funny. And what's really irritating and annoying is that I kept getting told later by actors, journalists, people outside the industry how much they enjoyed it. So, anyway, fuck 'em. It was a good film. 2 films reviewed badly, and 0 accountability for Sir Ridley. This is the start of a pattern where, no matter how the film performs, Ridley Scott is certain it was a banger, and any evidence to the contrary is because the audience is stupid, or the studio was stupid, or, anything other than he was stupid. Finally, the 28th film on the list is Legend, a 1985 dark fantasy starring Tom Cruise, Mia Sara, and Tim Curry that holds an average critic rating of 36%. Scott took inspiration from the Brothers Grimm and many of the early Disney classics, and he actually attempted to sell the film to Disney, but Disney deemed the film too dark. The critical consensus from Rotten Tomatoes reads, not even Ridley Scott's gorgeously realized set pieces can save Legend from its own tawdry tale, though it may be serviceable for those simply looking for fantasy eye candy. In an interview with Rolling Stone, Scott had this to say about the film: I also loved Legend, and the studio fucking killed that. I was 27 years ahead of Disney, that's all. So we're back to the studio being stupid. So that wraps up the 3 lowest ranked feature films of Ridley Scott's catalog, according to critics. And now we'll move on to the 3 best films. Starting with number 3, we have Blade Runner, the 1982 science fiction film based on a novel by renowned sci-fi author Philip K. Dick, and starring Harrison Ford, Rutger Hauer, Sean Young, and Edward James Olmos. With a critical average of 87%, the consensus for Blade Runner reads, misunderstood when it first hit theaters, the influence of Ridley Scott's mysterious neo-noir Blade Runner has deepened with time. A visually remarkable, achingly human sci-fi masterpiece. Blade Runner is one of the cornerstones of several genres beyond sci-fi as well. The film's dystopian, cyberpunk, and neo-noir elements have all been hailed as some of the best representations of each in film to date. Furthermore, the psychological and philosophical themes within the narrative have been the subject of entire courses in some higher education institutions. Though the film has become one of his most highly regarded by many, it failed to perform financially at the box office. Scott noted this in a later interview where he said, "Blade Runner was a disaster. It didn't play. People didn't get it. I was way ahead is what I think it was. I knew it was really good. I just thought, what the hell? They just don't get it." Ultimately, this might be where he learned his "people just don't get it" approach when his films fail, and this might be the one instance where I actually agree with him. People didn't get this film. There are some people that still don't really get this film. However, for fans of the sci-fi genre, I feel like this film is one of the sacred texts. The set design, the dialogue, the character work, the sound and lighting, all of it is excellent. Moving on to number 2 on the list, we have Thelma and Louise, a 1991 crime drama starring Susan Sarandon and Geena Davis, as well as Brad Pitt in his feature film debut. The film holds a critical review average of 88%, and the critical consensus on Rotten Tomatoes reads, "Driven by ride-or-die chemistry between Geena Davis and Susan Sarandon, while director Ridley Scott provides scorching visuals fit for a postcard. Thelma and Louise is a feminist adventure that's equal parts provocative and rollicking." The performances of Sarandon and Davis are really what make this film what it is, as the entire heart of the film is based on their character arcs, and those two actresses turn in stellar performances. They are charismatic and do a wonderful job of showing how their character evolves through each ordeal they overcome. That said, this film always felt like it was a movie that wasn't made for me. I remembered watching it as a younger man and decided to put it on before writing this to try and remember what happened in the story, and even though I just finished watching it, the only really thing I took away from it was that the two leads were acting their asses off. The story, for me, hinged on trauma and growth, but then it ends on a lesser version of the Butch and Sundance blaze of glory death. I'm still not sure how I'm supposed to feel about that, but again, I don't think this film was made for me. Moving on to number 1, as I'm sure most people could probably guess, we have Alien. Alien is a 1979 sci-fi horror film starring Sigourney Weaver, Ian Holm, and Tom Skerritt. The writers of the film originally pitched it as Jaws in space, though I feel like a haunted house movie in space might be more apt. The story revolves around a crew of space miners sent to investigate a distress beacon coming from an unknown vessel, only to have one of the crew impregnated by an alien species. The alien later erupts, literally, from one of the crew members, and the remaining crew have to find a way to kill the alien before it kills them. The critical average for the film is 92%, with a consensus that reads, "A modern classic, Alien blends science fiction, horror, and bleak poetry into a seamless whole." The popularity and cultural footprint of Alien almost goes without saying. This film was an absolute masterclass in creature design, and the xenomorph is perhaps the most iconic mainstay of the sci-fi bestiary. This film also launched an entire franchise, with 7 films in the mainline series and 2 spin-off movies pitting the xenomorph up against the Predator, another of the sci-fi monster greats. Ridley Scott himself summed it up pretty succinctly when he said, "I think Alien was a landmark. It's one of the really good science fiction movies." I agree with that wholeheartedly. Alien is a landmark film and one of the best science fiction films, and is also one of the best horror films I have ever seen. The set design was amazing, the character development was great, and the creature design and sound design are also legendary. If this had been Ridley Scott's only film, I would have no qualms with people calling him a legend. So that wraps up the top and bottom rankings of Ridley Scott's films according to critics. But before we move on to part 2, there is one final interesting note of worth. Ridley Scott has had exactly 3 films selected for preservation in the U.S. National Film Registry by the Library of Congress for being considered culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. The 3 films were the top 3 films listed here, namely Blade Runner, Thelma and Louise, and Alien. I find it interesting that those 2 things correlated exactly. Now, with all that said, we'll bring part 1 to a close.
So you are what you are in this world. That's either one or 2 things. Either you're somebody, or you're nobody. Be right back.
Part 2. Ridley Scott's best and worst films, according to audiences. The data in this section will be based on the average review scores for Ridley Scott's films taken from 3 review sites: Rotten Tomatoes, Metacritic, and IMDb. The additional factor of note with this section is that both the Metacritic and IMDb scores had to be converted to a 100-point scale to match the format of the Rotten Tomatoes scores. Much like the critic scores, the average score for Ridley Scott's films across all 3 websites was strikingly similar. The highest rating was from IMDb, with an average score across all 28 films of 70%, followed by Rotten Tomatoes where the score was 69%, and finally the score for Metacritic was 68%. Thus, the average audience score for all 28 reviewed films across these 3 websites was 69%, which is slightly higher than the 63% from critics, but still not as ringing an endorsement as one would expect from a director hailed as one of the greats. That said, let's take a look at his 3 lowest rated films according to audiences first. Coming in at number 26, with an average audience rating of 55%, is Someone to Watch Over Me, a neo-noir romantic thriller released in 1987 starring Tom Berenger as a police detective charged with protecting a rich, attractive woman who also happens to be a key witness in a murder trial played by Mimi Rogers. Someone to Watch Over Me is as generic as it sounds. The top audience review from Rotten Tomatoes goes something like this. You have seen it all before, now with adultery and spending a third of the movie for preamble. Ridley Scott had this to say about the film. I watched Someone to Watch Over Me the other night and I thought it was a pretty good movie. It's a great movie. So, surprisingly, he likes his own movies. I, for one, am shocked. He also stated, I loved White Squall. I loved Someone to Watch Over Me. Those were inexpensive films, but they were really well done. I loved A Good Year, which should have been big. Now, A Good Year has been mentioned already, and White Squall we will get to in time, but these are three of his misses that he still thinks should have been a hit. Again, and I would love to hear it if someone can provide me with the evidence, but I have yet to hear Sir Ridley ever admit that he made something that didn't work. And there's something about listening to someone talk about watching their own stuff and liking it that bothers me. Of course you liked it. You made it. It's like a parent talking about loving their child. I mean, no shit, you loved them. You made them. That doesn't mean the whole world is looking at that booger-riddled little whiner with the same adoration, you big dope. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent. On to number 27. The 27th ranked movie according to audiences was The Counselor, a 2013 crime thriller starring Michael Fassbender, Penelope Cruz, Cameron Diaz, Javier Bardem, and Brad Pitt. The film combines several dark themes in conjunction with the Mexican drug trade through the lens of a lawyer played by Fassbender. The average audience score for the film was 51%, and one of the top comments on Metacritic read, A-list cast and all the potential in the world buried in superfluous writing and a lack of cohesion. The Counselor is a movie that's so in love with itself it gives no one else a reason to love it, let alone care. While another put it even more succinctly with, a truly toxic film. Ridley Scott and Cormac McCarthy bring out the worst in each other. As I'm sure you can guess, Sir Ridley strongly disagrees with the negative reviews, and you'll never guess who he blames for it. I really loved The Counselor, which should have been fucking huge. With that cast, we should have had a $50 million weekend. After the marketing and advertising on that, I was ready to kill somebody. You don't preview films like that. You keep them in a box. You've got Brad, you've got Cameron Diaz, you've got Javier Bardem, you've got Penelope Cruz, you've got Michael Fassbender. Are you fucking kidding me? You don't show it, you advertise and you put it out and you'll have a 50 million opening weekend. So the studio again ruined a perfectly perfect Sir Ridley creation. I also find this comment interesting because it seems to say that just having the right cast guarantees you money when the age of star power has been long dead. Perhaps in 2013 it still existed to some extent, but only two of the actors in that list have talent that I respect, namely Fassbender and Bardem, but both of them have also made some seriously bad movies. Long story short, good actors still make shit movies, sir. If the movie had been good, the word of mouth could have made up for the lack of marketing. At what point do you go, maybe, just maybe, I did make a piece of shit movie that people just didn't like? Finally, at number 28, we have Exodus Gods and Kings, a 2014 biblical epic starring, well, everyone and their mom, to be honest. Christian Bale played Moses, which just seems wrong. Bale is an amazing actor, but I can't help but picture him shouting, "Let my people go," in the Batman voice.
Where's the trigger? Where is it? You never give it to an ordinary citizen. Where is it? Where's the trigger? Where is it?
The film averaged a 48% across the review sites, and a top review from Metacritic states that the film tries way too hard to be an epic remake for an epic story and falls flat with monotone acting and shallow intensity. Not to mention Ridley Scott's portrayal of Moses was simply terrible, as his character was mostly faithless and bland. The main quotes from Ridley Scott about this film appear to come from interviews when the movie was in production, because several people took issue with the number of Caucasians in the film. Scott's response to this was, "I can't mount a film of this budget where I have to rely on tax rebates in Spain and say that my lead actor is Mohammed so-and-so from such and such. I'm just not going to get it financed, so the question doesn't even come up." In other words, he tossed out the concept of cultural accuracy because Hollywood wouldn't give him the money to make the film otherwise. Then you read the reviews and see endless comments about how miscast it was. So, fine, get the financing with those actors and fail either way. Good strategy. That wraps up the 3 lowest ranked films according to audiences, and now we'll move on to the top ranked films. There was actually a 2-way tie for the second position with an average audience rating of 86% occupied by Blade Runner and Gladiator. As Blade Runner was covered in the previous section, I'll just talk a bit about Gladiator here. Released in 2000, Gladiator was another in a long line of historical epics from Ridley Scott that, while it was also attacked for its historical inaccuracies, ultimately proved greater than the sum of its historical missteps. Nominated for 12 Academy Awards, 14 BAFTA Awards, and 5 Golden Globes, Gladiator has both the highest number of award nominations and wins of Ridley Scott's backlog. Gladiator won Best Film and Best Original Score at both the Academy Awards and the Golden Globes, and it also won the Best Film Award at the BAFTAs, though it failed to win Best Director at any of the 3. Additionally, Russell Crowe also won Best Actor at the Academy Awards. Gladiator was also the second highest grossing film of 2000, trailing only Mission Impossible 2, which is tragic because that is by far the worst of the MI films. Gladiator also represented the first of 5 collaborations between Ridley Scott and Russell Crowe, the other 4 being A Good Year, Body of Lies, American Gangster, and Robin Hood. The last of which, namely Robin Hood, being their second foray into historical fiction, proved that Gladiator might have been one of those happy accident moments, because Robin Hood was absolutely dreadful and it failed in almost every way a film can. Gladiator, however, was a brilliantly acted film with a very relatable storyline. However, I feel it worth noting that, while Crowe received the Oscar for his role in this film, I think the character that truly makes the film work is Commodus, who was played by Joaquin Phoenix. Make no mistake, Crowe is great as Maximus, but every time I go back to watch this film, I am more and more impressed with how despicable Commodus is and how Phoenix's performance can make me actively wish death on him no matter how many times I watch it. In the end, Gladiator was chock full of great performances. The bonuses here were Richard Harris as Marcus Aurelius and Oliver Reed's Proximo. Overall, a truly great film. Sadly, Sir Ridley thought he could make it again, and we wouldn't notice him doing a half-assed job of copying his own homework. We did, sir. We noticed. About the original Gladiator, Scott had this to say about the film. I think one of the successes of Gladiator is how we managed to turn on a dime the character from one thing to another where you believe he is one thing and he is something very different. Here, I would agree with Ridley Scott. The character work and the turns the characters make are very well executed and fit to both their motivations and the overall plot structure. Finally, wrapping up the top 3, we have Alien again taking the top spot with an average audience rating of 90%. Thus, both Alien and Blade Runner were in the top 3 films according to both audiences and critics, and this is Alien's second time taking the number 1 spot. So here again is a quick look at Ridley Scott's 3 best and worst films according to audiences. And with that, we'll bring part 2 to a close.
Now, Delta or no Delta, that's a hot weapon. You know better than that. Your safety should be on at all times on base.
Well, that's my safety, sir.
Part 3. Ridley Scott's best and worst films according to profit margin. Before I begin the primary analysis, I want to play a little game called Context. As I said in the introduction, the third sentence of the Wikipedia article on Ridley Scott reads like this. Scott ranks among the highest grossing directors, with his films grossing a cumulative $5 billion worldwide. Taken on its own by a person not driven by a weird obsessive love of statistics and delving into obscure details about films, this sounds impressive. You could even make it sound more impressive by adding that Sir Ridley currently stands as the 8th highest grossing director of all time. Wow, he must make studios many oodles of the monies. I mean, calling him, you might as well start prepping the old Scrooge McDuck money pool. No? This is where my game of context comes in. So, as I said, Ridley Scott currently sits in 8th place on the highest grossing directors list, with an exact cumulative box office total of $5,043,906,906. What if I told you that, of the top 20 directors, only one, Steven Spielberg with 37, has directed more films than Ridley Scott? That might not sound too bad, but what if I add in that the average number of films directed by the top 20 directors is 16? That is 13 less films than Ridley Scott. What if I then add in that of the top 10 directors, Ridley Scott is the only one without a billion-dollar film? Now, all of this might not seem like a big deal so far, but what if I told you that I started off with a few warm-ups and that the fastball has yet to come? Don't believe me? Well, here's a two-seamer. When the total box office earnings of each director is divided by the number of films the director has directed to get a per-film average, Ridley Scott dropped from number 8 to number 19 out of 20. He's ahead of only Ron Howard then, who has directed 2 less films than Scott. In short, Ron Howard, with 27 films directed, is a total of $617,593,799 behind Ridley Scott, and he's directed 2 less films. I would say Ron might be able to pull this out since he has 3 upcoming films, but sadly, Ridley has 5. Count 'em. 5 directing projects upcoming according to IMDb. And the freaking dude is 87. I'm starting to wonder who's going to retire first, Sir Ridley or the dinosaurs from Jurassic Park. In short, all this contextual data so far seems to indicate that Ridley Scott's place on the highest grossing director list is due more to the quantity of films directed rather than the quality, given that he's directed about 12 more films on average than only one other person on the list. Okay, so that was the 2-seamer. Now let's get to the straight heat. The 4-seam fastball, Randy Johnson style. So you tell me that Ridley Scott has a $5 billion lifetime box office. The natural question is this: what is his lifetime reported budget then? Because we need to know that to figure out how successful he's been. Well, the answer to that is $2,297,500,000. Therefore, if we subtract his lifetime reported budget from his reported box office, we get a sum of $2,746,406,906. That cuts his lifetime earning almost perfectly in half. But wait, that is just the setup. The ball is still in my glove, my good man. So we've cut his box office earnings in half, which would give him a lifetime profit margin of 54%. Which means that for every dollar of box office profit from Ridley Scott's films, the studios made about 54 cents. That is profit, but not great profit. Here's where the heat comes. The dirty little lie that many who read into these numbers know is that reported budgets do not account for either advertising costs or the cut of the revenue that theaters take from the ticket sales. Thus, the standard calculation for determining how profitable a film is to multiply the reported budget by 2.5 and then run the calculation. What do we get then? Well then, Ridley Scott has a lifetime box office earning of negative $699,843,094. Yes, I just said negative. To put this in a clearer light, he has a lifetime profit margin of negative 14%. That means, on average, for every dollar of box office profit his films make, the studio loses 14 cents. That is, well, insane. So again, Ridley Scott is only on the highest grossing directors list because he is the Stephen King of directors. He's churned out so much content that it's almost inevitable that he's on the list. The truly insane thing is that by lumping his films together into one nebulous mass, it makes his average profit margin better. When the data on each film is input and their individual profit margins are produced in order to calculate an average across all 28 films, we get a staggering profit margin of negative 24%, meaning studios average losing 24 cents for every dollar of box office profit when Ridley Scott directs a film. As a note here, this calculation actually removed 2 statistical outliers from the analysis in order to try and be as fair as possible, the outliers being The Last Duel and 1492 Conquest of Paradise. The Last Duel gets the special COVID pass, and 1492 was removed because neither the Numbers.com nor Box Office Mojo reported any of the international ticket sales, and all the links that Wikipedia provided to claims of it making $47 million internationally couldn't be verified. Furthermore, that's still $10 million short of what Ridley Scott said it made. In the end, 1492 had a staggeringly bad profit margin, and I want to err on the side of caution should that result be due to lack of data on my part. Getting back to the main point, that negative 24% is the most favorable number I could come up with. To further sweeten that number, I only multiplied the reported budgets from 2010 onwards by 2.5, and I used a more conservative 1.5 from 1979 up to 2009. All this to say, I tried to be as fair as I could in analyzing this, and the numbers are still painful. If we leave all 28 films in, the profit margin drops to negative 81%. That's almost a full dollar lost for every dollar of profit. So not only would the studio make no money, but they would actually have to pay an extra dollar for every dollar of box office that they don't make. Even if we use a conservative profit margin where we compare only the reported budget and assume the marketing costs were zero, and the theaters were nice and gave the studio all the profits, and we removed two of the outliers, both The Last Duel and 1492, his average profit margin is 31%, meaning the films would average 31 cents for every dollar of box office profit. However, and I must stress this, even that 31% is living in magical dreamland. Long story long, I don't think profitability is something Ridley Scott should ever brag about. Now, with the preamble complete, let's take a look at Ridley Scott's worst 3 films according to profit margin. Even as I say that, I need to make an exception here that I explained earlier. Technically, 1492, Conquest of Paradise, is 28th with a profit margin of negative 8.93, meaning a staggering loss of 893%, or $8.93 lost for every dollar of box office profit. However, as I mentioned earlier, I will remove that film on the assumption that the international numbers have simply eluded the internet. Thus, starting with number 25, with a profit margin of negative 120%, is the ironically titled All the Money in the World, which is not what this film made. All the Money in the World was a 2017 crime thriller about the real-life kidnapping of multi-billionaire J. Paul Getty's grandson, John Paul III, and the former's refusal to acquiesce to the kidnapper's demands. The cast list comes with a bit of a troubled story that actually makes its poor financial performance less a fault of the film and more a fault of bad cultural timing. Initially, the role of J. Paul Getty was played by Kevin Spacey, but the timing of the release of the film came around the same time that numerous allegations of sexual misconduct arose surrounding Spacey. Opting to avoid the controversy, the production team decided to replace Spacey with Christopher Plummer, which cost the film an additional $10 million. To add another layer of sad commentary to this film, Mark Wahlberg allegedly demanded an additional $1.5 million for the additional 9 days of shooting, and due to a clause in his contract that allowed him first refusal based on the cast of the film, he refused to agree to Plummer's casting until he was paid the $1.5 million. Sadly for Marky Mark, all this did was cause an uproar about the gender pay gap, as his co-star Michelle Williams was apparently paid $80 in per diems, which would have amounted to around $720 compared to Wahlberg's $1.5 million. This led Marky Mark to donating $1.5 million to the legal defense fund connected to the Time's Up Foundation in Michelle Williams' name. So, in essence, the film had to deal with 2 different yet somehow eerily connected cultural time bombs before the film even released. All that said, the additional $10 million in reshoots shifted this from a negative 76% profit margin to a negative 120% profit margin. The film would have lost money either way, but the reshoots definitely made it worse. The critical response to the film was above average, though, with an average critical rating of 73% and an audience average of 65%, with a critical consensus on Rotten Tomatoes reading, All the Money in the World offers an absorbing portrayal of a true story brought compellingly to life by a powerful performance from Christopher Plummer. Thus, the film appears to be at least somewhat better qualitatively than the financial performance would indicate, though the critical rating still leaves it in the 8th position amongst all of Ridley Scott's films, and the audience rating places it 16th. Ridley Scott had this to say to Entertainment Weekly when asked if replacing Spacey would cause problems for the film. "If you forget as a director your one priority is to put bums on seats and you better entertain, so any form of publicity is useful. Need I go further? Well, it appears that the adage of any press is good press did not work out in this instance, and Mr. Scott was thus unable to fulfill his priority of putting bums in seats. Moving on to the 26th film on the list with a profit margin of negative 129%, we have Napoleon. Ridley Scott's 2023 biological war epic about the legendary French emperor brought Scott back together with Joaquin Phoenix, who had gone on to win several notable acting awards in his time between starring as Commodus and Gladiator. So reuniting Ridley Scott with an actor that appeared to be at the top of his game and had turned in a stellar performance in their previous combined effort making a war epic was promising. Sadly, unlike with Gladiator, Scott failed to craft a narrative strong enough to distract viewers from the historical inaccuracies, and his response to the criticisms eventually became more popular than the film itself. For example, when the French press started attacking the film, we got perhaps one of the best Ridley Scott sass remarks in a BBC interview when he said, "The French don't even like themselves. The audience that I showed it to in Paris, they loved it." Scott also told TV historian Dan Snow that he needed to get a life in a New Yorker article from 2023 when Snow broke down the inaccuracies of Napoleon on TikTok. Finally, toward the end of the BBC interview, Scott had this to say to critics of his lack of historical accuracy. Were you there? Oh, you weren't there? Then you don't know. So basically, if you weren't there, which means everyone on Earth, including Ridley Scott, then we don't get to comment. Solid logic there, sir. I see why you got the sir. Sir. Finally, coming in at number 27 with a profit margin of negative 457%, we have White Squall. White Squall was a 1996 disaster survival film starring Jeff Bridges and an ensemble of young male actors that included Jeremy Sisto and Ryan Philippe, and a story based on the novel The Last Voyage of the Albatross. The film had a production budget of $38 million and barely managed to make $10 million at the box office. White Squall also stood as the middle film in a string of 3 consecutive box office failures for Ridley Scott, starting with 1492 Conquest of Paradise and ending with G.I. Jane in 1997. Scott wouldn't have another string of failures like that until 2017, where beginning with Alien Covenant and running up to Gladiator 2, his last 6 films have all resulted in negative profit margins. In a comment about what drove him toward making White Squall, Scott had this to say: White Squall and Someone to Watch Over Me are, I think, both really nice little movies. I think it came off someone saying in my office, because Legend didn't work at the box office and Blade Runner didn't work at the box office, why don't you make something about ordinary people? So I went off and made these 2 smaller movies, which I think actually turned out pretty well. But gradually I realized that what I do best is universes, and I shouldn't be afraid of that. That's what I do great. This is an interesting comment to try and dissect, particularly when he's referencing universes. I think Blade Runner could apply here if I take his meaning correctly, and Alien as well, but the problem is I think he sees historical fiction the same way, which is what has gotten him into trouble more often than it hasn't. That wraps up the Ridley Scott directed films with the worst profit margins, and now we'll move on to the 3 films with the best profit margins. There was once again a tie for the number 2 spot between Gladiator and Black Rain, with identical profit margins of 66%, meaning the studio likely made around 66 cents for every dollar of box office profit. As I spoke about Gladiator in the previous section, I'll just cover a bit about Black Rain here. Black Rain was a neo-noir crime thriller starring Michael Douglas as a cop caught up in trying to bring a member of the Japanese Yakuza to justice. When they escort him back to Japan, the criminal escapes and Douglas and his partner, played by Andy Garcia, try to track him down. With a production budget of $30 million and a worldwide box office of $133 million, the film was financially successful. However, reviews of the film were mixed. Black Rain holds a critical review average of 55% and an audience average of 62%. Speaking only for myself, as someone who has lived and worked in Japan for over 15 years, movies like this are hard to watch. It's a very cliched and condescending portrayal of Japanese culture from someone without even the most basic understanding of it. It might track with people who have never been here, but for anyone who has, the movie comes off as incredibly juvenile and insulting. Add to that it's absolutely peak 90s action cop schlock, I can see why the movie tends to hover around the 50-50 mark. 50% might find it above average because they hold the same weird view of Japanese culture and enjoy campy 90s action. But those are the only people who will be entertained by this trash. I'm sorry, I really hate this movie and everything it stands for. I realize that is me putting my personal bias into it, but I fully agree with Gene Siskel's review of the film. The cross-cultural action picture might have worked if the filmmakers had come up with a script in which Douglas's character had been rendered weak and confused by being a fish trying to swim in strange waters. But instead he is presented as a traditional action hero dominating everyone in sight. The cultural imperialism of that decision makes for a routine and frequently offensive story full of Asian stereotypes. Director Scott certainly knows how to photograph arresting architecture, but the high-gloss look of Black Rain only intensifies the shortcomings of the pedestrian story. Still, the film made oodles of money, so I have to admit that there was definitely an audience for it. Moving on to the final movie on the list, Ridley Scott's best film in terms of profit margin was, surprise surprise, Alien, with a profit margin of 91%. The production budget of Alien back in 1979 was $10.7 million, and the film had a box office of $188 million. That equals about $800 million in 2025 on a budget of $47 million. That is Alien's third time in the top 3, and also its third time in the number 1 spot. So let's take a final look at Ridley Scott's 3 best and worst films according to profit margin. And with that, we'll bring part 3 to a close.
Master Chief?
Lieutenant, seek life elsewhere.
Suck my dick!
Part 4. Ridley Scott's best and worst films according to estimated domestic ticket sales. Before we get into the lists, a few notes on how the following statistics were determined. I utilized data from thenumbers.com to determine the average price of movie tickets in the US from 1995 to the present. For the years prior to 1995, I took data from Wikipedia. I then took the domestic box office totals for each film and divided them by the average price of movie tickets in the US to get an estimated number of tickets sold domestically. I had to restrict this analysis to domestic ticket sales because the international sales incorporate a wide range of markets and prices, and it's incredibly difficult to parse out that data. Finally, I want to stress here again that this is an estimate only. That said, let's get into the analysis. First off, the estimated average number of domestic ticket sales for Ridley Scott's films is just over 11 million per film. The 28th film on the list was actually The Last Duel, but because that is a rather unfair rock to throw at that film because it was released during COVID, we will focus on the 25th through the 27th ranked films instead. So starting with number 25, we have a film we've seen before, The Counselor, with an estimated domestic ticket sales of just over 2 million. Given that this film was the second lowest rated film according to audiences as well, it makes sense that the ticket sales were not very good. Furthermore, this appears to support what I argued previously in that Ridley Scott seemed to assume that the strength of the cast would have ensured a big opening weekend, but it appears that the overall quality of the film was apparent enough that the word of mouth likely contributed as much to its failure as any lack of studio marketing. In fact, perhaps the studio gave up trying to market it knowing it wasn't very good and they were hoping to save themselves some money. Coming in at number 26, we have yet another familiar film, 1492 Conquest of Paradise, with an estimated domestic ticket sales of about 1.7 million. But, as we might remember, this is all because Ridley Scott cast a French person in the lead role, and, Americans need someone from Texas if we are going to understand what they're saying. Guess he should have hired Matthew McConaughey, and then he would have been rolling in the bucks. Actually, to be honest, that sounds like a movie so bad it would be good. Matthew McConaughey in a cowboy hat playing Christopher Columbus. I would watch that. Well, I guess Sir Ridley was right. Finally, coming in at number 27 was yet another film we've seen in a previous list, A Good Year, with an estimated domestic ticket sales of 1.1 million. Now, this film performed better with audiences than The Counselor, averaging 67%, where The Counselor averaged 51%, and one interpretation might be that the strength of The Counselor's cast actually did save it a bit and could account for the additional million tickets sold. It might also have been about competition at the box office when each film was released. Either way, A Good Year was also Scott's second lowest rated film according to critics, and now it's the lowest rated in terms of domestic ticket sales. So something about this film obviously wasn't working very well to end up having performed so poorly according to 2 of the 4 criteria. That wraps up the 3 worst performing films according to estimated domestic ticket sales, and interestingly, all 3 films had appeared previously in other parts of the analysis. Now we are going to move on to the best performing films, where we have 2 more repeats that I'm sure many people can guess, and one final new movie stepping into the fray. Coming in at the number 3 spot is Hannibal, with an estimated domestic ticket sales of just over 29 million. Hannibal was a 2001 psychological thriller based on the Thomas Harris book of the same name, and was a follow-up film to 1991's The Silence of the Lambs. The novel by Harris received mixed reviews, and many felt that he rushed to write a sequel with Lecter based solely on how popular the film adaptation was. In short, it felt more like a cash grab than a novel that arose organically from narrative inspiration. The film then felt exactly the same, the most disappointing aspect in both the film and the novel being the decimation of Clarice Starling as a character, which was highlighted in a review of the book by Charles DeLint in Fantasy and Science Fiction. Hannibal is a huge disappointment, not because it's not the book I wanted, but because of its disturbing subtexts, which are disturbing for all the wrong reasons. A monster such as Lecter shouldn't be set up as a sympathetic character, and Harris should have played fair with Starling, instead of twisting her so far out of character simply to provide a shock ending. While many might argue, yeah, but that's a review of the book, sadly the film makes all the same mistakes. Then you might say, hey, isn't this the best section? It obviously sold well. Yes, it did. But I think that has much less to do with the quality of the film and much more to do with people's interest in the Hannibal Lecter character, and particularly Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of him. Thus, while it did sell tickets, I would also point out that it holds a critical review average of 48% and an audience review average of 65%, putting it in the 24th place critically and the 18th place with audiences. In short, people rushed to see it, and they didn't particularly seem to like what they saw. I also noticed that Wikipedia listed this film as the 10th highest grossing film of 2001, and I decided to go and check the list, and I had a good chuckle. The top 5 movies are all excellent films with incredible cultural footprints. Number 1 was Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, or Philosopher's Stone, depending on which side of the pond you are from. Number 2 was The Fellowship of the Ring. Number 3 was Monsters, Inc. Number 4 was Shrek. And number 5 was Ocean's 11. All really good films. Then we get into 6 through 10, and all of these films are dumpster fires in one way or another. Number 6, Michael Bay's Pearl Harbor. If you don't believe me about the dumpster fire part, please go watch Team America. Number 7, The Mummy Returns, which was good until the CGI Scorpion King showed up. Number 8, Jurassic Park 3, which I honestly have a secret love for if it weren't for all the bits with the raptors, particularly the talking raptor. If you don't know, please go watch the movie. You will hate it as much as I did. Number 9, Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes. And then we have Hannibal at number 10. I just found it incredibly funny how the quality really dropped off. You have 5 incredible films that have stood the test of time, and 5 films that have been lampooned for poor quality. Really interesting list. Anyway, getting back to the job at hand. The second best film according to estimated domestic ticket sales was Alien, being knocked out of the top spot for the first and only time with an estimated domestic ticket sales of 33.5 million tickets sold. So Alien made it into the top 3 for all 4 criteria and was in the top spot for 3 out of 4. The film that was able to knock it out was Gladiator, with an estimated domestic ticket sales of 34.8 million. That is Gladiator's 3rd time in the top 3 and its 1st time in the top spot. With all that said, let's take a quick look back at the best and worst of Ridley Scott's films according to estimated domestic ticket sales. And with that, that brings us to the end of part 4.
Can you keep a secret? Cross your heart and ought to die.
Father, Son, and House of Gucci.
Okay.
Part 5. Ridley Scott's worst films according to their average ranking across the 4 criteria in this analysis. Due to there being several ties, I will cover a total of 10 films here, and we'll start with the 2 films that tied for 18th place out of 28. With an identical ranking of 18.25, we have Robin Hood and G.I. Jane. Now, neither of these films performed poorly enough to make it into the bottom 3 of any of the lists, but they have some interesting lowlights. For Robin Hood, you can see it did manage to rank relatively well in terms of domestic ticket sales, but with a profit margin of negative 63%, mainly due to its $210 million budget back in 2010, which would be well over $300 million in 2025, and a critic average of 37%, one can imagine how it ranks as one of his worst films. G.I. Jane, on the other hand, really only stands out for the poor audience average of 58%. However, it's also worth noting that it was in the lower 50% of Scott's films for every category except domestic ticket sales, and its performance internationally was shockingly bad at, well, 0. That might be due to lack of data, but I could also imagine with the content of the film that this movie could track as a 0 abroad. Before I move on, I want to reiterate though, that neither of these 2 films appeared on any of the worst 3 lists from the previous sections. The remaining films, however, all had at least one appearance on those lists. Coming in at the 20th position, we have Napoleon, with an average ranking of 20.5, and A Good Year, with an average ranking of 20.75. Napoleon's 2 claims to disrepute were a terrible profit margin of negative 129% and a low average audience response of 58%. A Good Year, then, which appeared on 2 of the worst 3 lists from the previous sections, earned its place here with a low critical rating average of 37% and poor domestic ticket sales performance with just over 1 million tickets sold. Moving on to the 21st ranked films, there was a 3-way tie. First up is Exodus: Gods and Kings with an average ranking of 21.25. This film can attribute its place on the lower half of the list primarily to the review ratings, with an average critic score of 42% and an average audience score of 48%. Interestingly, this is the only film in Ridley Scott's directing catalog to rate below 50% with both critics and audiences. Next up, in the 21st position with an average score of 21.5, is Legend. This film got here based on a poor performance in 3 out of the 4 criteria, namely a profit margin of negative 60%, domestic ticket sales of just over 4 million, and a critical review average of 36%. Finally, with an average ranking of 21.75, is The Counselor. This film actually boasted a positive profit margin, but that is where the good news ends. Selling just over 2 million tickets domestically, a critic review average of 48%, and an audience review average of 51%, this film and Exodus seem to be the 2 films that audiences and critics agree have, at best, a 50-50 chance of being considered an above-average film. That brings us to the films holding the 22nd place on the list, and there was a 2-way tie here between Someone to Watch Over Me and White Squall. Someone to Watch Over Me was a bit higher with an average ranking of exactly 22. The standout rankings here were a profit margin of negative 87%, domestic ticket sales of around 2.6 million, and an audience review average of 55%. White Squall then averaged a ranking of 22.25 thanks mainly to a negative 457% profit margin, domestic ticket sales of around 2.3 million, and a critical review average of 55%. Thus, both Someone to Watch Over Me and White Squall performed poorly on the financial front, and it seems that the former was more popular with critics and the latter was more popular with audiences. Wrapping up our worst of the worst rankings, coming in at the 25th place with an average ranking of 25.75 is 1492 Conquest of Paradise. As much as I could point at the poor profit margin, I have to reiterate that there seems to be potentially missing data. That said, with domestic ticket sales of around 1.7 million, a critical average of 40%, and an audience average of 58%, the film performed poorly in all four categories. Thus, while there may be some missing international sales data that makes this film slightly less dumpster fire worthy, the rest of the data seems to indicate that it would still be somewhere within the bottom 5 no matter what. For example, even if we take Ridley Scott at his word and assume that the film made 57 million internationally, that gives it a profit margin of negative 10%. That would move its profit margin ranking up to 15th and give it an average ranking in the list of 22.8, still last no matter how the cake is cut. The final note for the worst of the worst films is to talk briefly about the average performance of these 10 films across all four criteria. First, these 10 films averaged a negative 179% profit margin, or an average loss of $1.79 for every dollar of box office profit. Now, if we want to be the fairy godmother again and give Ridley the benefit of the doubt and bump up 1492's profit margin to negative 10%, the average profit margin of these 10 films was still around negative 90%. Second, these 10 films averaged a domestic ticket sales of 5.1 million, which is 6.2 million tickets below his overall average of 11.3 million. Third, the critical average across these films was 48%, meaning critics felt the average critic had a less than 50% chance of finding these films above average. Audiences, on the other hand, rated them an average of 59%. So here are the bottom 10 films one last time before we move on. And with that said, we'll bring part 5 to a close.
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe.
Part 6. Ridley Scott's best films according to their average ranking across the four criteria in this analysis. In order to balance out the number of films in the worst category, I'm going to start with 5 honorable mentions before delving into the top 5 films. Coming in at number 6, with identical scores of 7.5, we have Black Hawk Down and Blade Runner. Starting with Black Hawk Down, the highlight of its performance was its domestic ticket sales, with an estimated domestic ticket sales of around 19 million. The film also rated highly with audiences, with an average score of 81%. Blade Runner, on the other hand, played out much as any fan of the film would have assumed. It was rated highly by both critics and audiences, with nearly identical average scores of 87% and 86% respectively, but the film performed poorly financially with a profit margin of negative 6% and a domestic ticket sales sitting around 200,000 tickets below Ridley Scott's average of 11.3 million. On the positive side, Blade Runner garnered a total of 11 nominations across the Academy Awards, BAFTAs, and Golden Globes, and it also earned 3 BAFTA wins, namely for cinematography, costume design, and production design. Moving on to number 8 on the list, with an average ranking of 10, was Prometheus. Almost the inverse of Blade Runner, Prometheus performed relatively well financially, but the critical scores tended to be a bit lower. One might assume that the financial performance could be attributed to audiences' interest in what Ridley Scott could do with a follow-up to what many consider his best film. However, when you look at the financial and critical performance of Ridley's follow-up to Prometheus, the financial performance of that film likely follows with the less than stellar critical rating of this film. In other words, while some try to defend Prometheus, one reason that Alien Covenant likely failed is because a significant enough portion of the audience were disappointed with Prometheus. Next up on the list at number 9 is Hannibal, with an average ranking of 12th. As you can see, this film can attribute all of its success to its financial performance. However, with a 48% critical average and a 65% audience average, it seems pretty clear that the audiences showed up hoping to get another look at Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of one of the greatest film characters of all time, but a significant portion of them probably wished they could ask for a refund once they saw the result. Wrapping up the honorable mentions is Gladiator 2, with an average ranking of 12.5. Although the film boasts a terrible profit margin of negative 36%, the film appears to have sold an above average number of tickets domestically and fared relatively well with both critics and audiences. With that said, we'll move on to the best of the best, the top 5 films. Coming in at number 5 with an average ranking of 6.75, we have Thelma and Louise. The highlight here is the critical average of 88%, but the film also boasted a strong profit margin of 46%. Furthermore, as I noted in an earlier section, this is one of Ridley Scott's 3 films that have been selected for preservation by the U.S. Library of Congress. The film was also nominated for 6 Academy Awards, 8 BAFTAs, and 4 Golden Globes for a total of 18 nominations across 3 award shows, which is second only to Gladiator in Ridley Scott's directorial career. Additionally, the film earned 2 wins from those 18 nominations, both going to Kali Kahori for Best Original Screenplay. And I apologize if I mispronounced her last name, did the best I could with that. The 4th ranked film was American Gangster, with an average ranking of 5.75. This film performed well across all 4 criteria, with a 44% profit margin, almost 19 million domestic tickets sold, an average critic rating of 79%, and an average audience rating of 82%, so the film was an all-around success. The film was also nominated for 2 Academy Awards, 5 BAFTAs, and 3 Golden Globes, though it failed to walk away with any wins. In the 3rd position we have The Martian, with an average ranking of 4.25. Much like American Gangster, The Martian was a solid all-around performing film. The profit margin was 59%, the film sold an estimated 27 million tickets domestically, falling just short of Scott's top 3, and it performed well with both critics and audiences, scoring average ratings of 86% and 83% respectively. The Martian was also nominated for 7 Academy Awards, 6 BAFTAs, and 3 Golden Globes, and wins for Best Actor in a Musical or Comedy for Matt Damon and Best Motion Picture Musical or Comedy at the Golden Globes. Looking at the total nominations across these 3 film award shows, The Martian's total of 16 nominations ranks 3rd, behind only Thelma and Louise and, of course, Gladiator. At the penultimate position then we have Gladiator with an average ranking of 3.5. Gladiator had a strong profit margin of 66%, even with a budget of just over $100 million, which is the equivalent of almost $200 million in 2025. The film had a solid box office total of just over $450 million, which is equivalent to approximately $830 million in 2025. This film also had the highest estimated domestic ticket sales of all of Ridley Scott's film and was the 2nd highest rated film with audiences. Finally, as I've stated elsewhere, this film also garnered the largest number of total award nominations across the Academy Awards, BAFTAs, and Golden Globes, with 31 nominations and 11 wins. Last, but certainly not least, at the number 1 spot is Alien, with an average ranking of 1.25. This should come as no surprise to anyone who has watched this far. Alien is Ridley Scott's best performing film according to profit margin at 91%, critical review average at 92%, and audience review average at 90%. The only criteria in which it failed to finish first was in domestic ticket sales, but even then, Alien came in second with an impressive estimated sales of 33.5 million tickets. Alien was also nominated for 11 awards across the 3 big award shows, winning the Oscar for Best Visual Effects and the BAFTA Awards for Best Production Design and Best Sound. Alien has also been highly ranked in lists of the greatest science fiction films of all time, such as in 2008 when the American Film Institute ranked it 7th. Now, before we bring this portion to a close, let's take a look at the average performance across the 4 primary criteria in this analysis for Ridley Scott's top 10 films. First, the films averaged a profit margin of 36%, which is positive, but not really jaw-dropping. I think this continues to highlight the problem that, while Ridley Scott's films tend to make a decent profit at the box office, they also tend to cost an astronomical amount to produce, thus making him much more of a financial gamble than people like to pretend. Second, these 10 films averaged an estimated domestic ticket sales of 21.5 million, which is 10.2 million above his average. Third, his critical review average was 76%. Meaning there is a 76% chance the average critic would give them an above average review, while audiences felt there was a 79% chance of the film being rated above average. For those of us that cared about our grades in undergrad, if my report card came back with those scores, I would have had a panic attack. However, Sir Ridley may have been like one of those frat boys who always showed up to my history classes mumbling something about, "C's get degrees, bro." Well, it appears in Hollywood that C's get you multi-billion-dollar budgets, so you can shit all over historical accuracy and insult anyone who wants to pay any attention to the details with the rhetorical acumen of a junior high school student shouting, "Were you there? Then stuff it, nerd boy." But I digress. Now, with all my repressed rage vented, we can wrap up part 6 and move on to the closing section.
I can't lie to you about your chances, but you have my sympathies.
Part 7. Closing thoughts. The directorial legacy of Ridley Scott is complicated. There are men and women in Hollywood who might argue that, no matter how many duds he's crafted, his overall skill still rates him as one of the greatest to ever take up the chair. The problem is that, if you know anything about Hollywood, or anything about professions where ego is the primary unifying characteristic, you will know that circle jerks are a lot more common in those fields. Why? Well, when you have an incredible ego, you like to have it stroked, and the best way to get stroked is, to give a few strokes, and round we go. Long story short, I don't trust the people in Hollywood to tell me who is and is not good at the job because Hollywood is full of egotistical liars who want to be stroked. I'd rather trust the numbers. While the numbers might also be deceiving at times, and people can definitely use statistics as a weapon in deceptive ways, it's much easier to double-check them. When Joaquin Phoenix bangs on about how Ridley Scott is the most detail-oriented director he's ever worked with and brags about how he draws pictures of his sets and whatnot, does that really make you like Napoleon more? No, it was still a terrible movie that performed terribly. So how do we cross-check the lies that Hollywood people spew? The only real way is to go and consume the product and decide if it's good or not. When people don't want to consume it and it makes no money, that says something. When people do consume it and say it's average at best, that also says something. In the end, while there are still going to be experts who hail Sir Ridley as a visionary director of immense talent, that has to be taken in balance with all the other factors. That said, let's take another quick look at the top 10 from part 6. I said at the outset that this review would use 4 criteria to evaluate Ridley Scott's films, and that none of the criteria was a proxy for objective quality. However, looking at this list, I can guess that if I were to rate Scott's films on objective quality, I assume that this list would stay basically the same, save for 2 main changes. Blade Runner and The Last Duel would likely be shifted, and I will explain why. These 2 films are the only films in Ridley Scott's directorial career where the combined financial performance was significantly lower than the combined critical and audience review average. Now, for anyone that might ask about films skewed in the other direction, meaning the financial numbers were significantly higher than the critical numbers, yes, we had one, Hannibal, and I attempted to address that at several points. If anything, I think that argues for Hannibal dropping down in the final analysis. Thus, Blade Runner and The Last Duel likely deserve to rise up in the overall rankings because their financial performances don't seem to match their critical reviews. So, and again, I want to reiterate that this is an assumption. I would guess that Alien, Gladiator, and Blade Runner would occupy the top 3 spots. If I were reviewing them, Blade Runner would probably be number 1, followed by Alien, and then Gladiator. However, I would have to admit here that I have an extreme bias toward science fiction, and I put strong emphasis on character development over plot, so I can see where some reviewers might rearrange these 3. However, I cannot imagine a list of Scott's films where these 3 are not the top 3. They are, at worst, 8.5 to full 10s out of 10. They're all great films. Beyond that, there is a weird middle ground occupied by The Martian, American Gangster, Black Hawk Down, Thelma and Louise, and the other film that I feel should have been in the top 10, The Last Duel. For myself personally, I would put them in this order: Black Hawk Down, American Gangster, The Martian, The Last Duel, and Thelma and Louise. Again, the only one of these I've watched in the last 2 months is Thelma and Louise. I would have to admit, I have a bias against gangster films. I'm really not a fan of the genre, and I also have a serious aversion to Matt Damon. Actually, one of my favorite moments in all of cinema was seeing the Team America version of him. So, yeah. The Martian is a fine film. I enjoyed it when I watched it, but it is completely forgettable, which I feel applies to all 5 of these films. Black Hawk Down had the greatest impression on me, and it is one of the only ones I've gone back to watch occasionally because there were things about it that I find compelling. The others were, like the 10-cent chocolates I sometimes buy from the convenience store at checkout. You will never write home about it, but it's also not something you would waste your time complaining about. It just is. It's fine. It got the job done. So these films, I would assume, are all likely objectively above average to good with ratings somewhere between 5.6 to 8.0. What that means is that, in my estimation, Ridley Scott has a total of 8 films out of 28 he's directed that are above average, and 20 films that range in quality from below average to complete dumpster fires. And yes, I would argue that the below average quality rating starts with Prometheus, a stance that I will soon be able to defend. That, my friends, is not the CV of a legend. That is the CV of a man who inherited the company from his daddy and somehow managed to bumble his way into 1 or 2 good ideas in 45 years. Sadly, for Sir Scott, 2 of his best ideas were 2 of his first 3 films. Think about that. Ridley Scott peaked in 1982, had a random resurgence in 2000, and has been riding the success of 3 great films for the last 25 years, taking hot shits all over history and shouting at us if we don't like how he creates his universes. So I have two last things I want to cover before closing this out. As a final parting shot at the directing career of Ridley Scott, I want to point out some final statistics. First, of the 28 films in this analysis, only 4 of them managed to attain an average critic rating above 80%. Second, he fared only slightly better with audiences, with 6 films receiving an average above 80%. Third, only 12 of the 28 films, meaning less than half, had positive profit margins. Finally, only 13 of his films managed to sell over 10 million tickets domestically. All in all, when you really dig into the data on Ridley Scott's history, the most impressive thing just might be his sassy remarks to criticism. That brings me to how and why I became interested in Ridley Scott's backlog to begin with. I started this journey for a relatively simple reason. I love Alien and Blade Runner. They are 2 of my favorite films. Then in 2012 when Prometheus came out, I was really excited. My mind set on this idea that Ridley Scott was the nexus point of 2 of my great sci-fi loves, and if he was returning to direct an Alien film, a series I held a deep love for would finally be brought back to its former glory. I will never forget how I felt watching it for the first time though. A friend of mine framed it in a way that I will never forget. He said, "It's like kissing your sister. Yeah, you got some, but at what cost?" I toiled with this for a while until Alien Covenant came out, and a thought that should have struck me much earlier finally dawned on me. What if everything that was great about Alien and Blade Runner had less to do with Ridley Scott than I thought? I decided then that I wanted to go through and review all of the Alien films. However, that didn't seem like it would be enough. It wasn't enough to just say that Alien was excellent and Prometheus and Covenant are garbage. The latter are garbage, but I feel like the garbage in those films can be laid at the feet of Ridley Scott much more readily than the praise from the first film. In other words, I don't think Ridley Scott deserves the majority of the praise for the first Alien, but he does deserve the majority of the blame for Prometheus and Covenant. So I needed to lay the groundwork of his history as a director so it didn't just come off as me having a bit of a whinge. With the groundwork now laid, hopefully we'll make the contributions of the writing teams and production teams on the related films stand out more as to why the first film worked so well and why the sequels did not. Now, for anyone that wants to jump on me immediately and say the sequels did work, let me ask you this. Why did the Ridley Scott films have to stop and Fede Alvarez had to take over? Why did we get Romulus? Why did Covenant fail? There are a lot of questions you need to start asking yourself before you start trying to argue that Prometheus and Covenant worked. They didn't. So stop it. Now, all that said, my plan from this point is to review the Alien franchise film by film. This is going to be 7 films in total. Alien, Aliens, Alien 3 or Alien Cubed, depending on how you want to read their stylization of the title, Alien Resurrection, Prometheus, Alien Covenant, and Alien Romulus. For each successive film, I will begin by analyzing the backlog of each director, as I've done here. So I will do my best and worst for James Cameron following the Alien review, then a best and worst for David Fincher following Aliens, a best and worst for Jean-Pierre Jeunet following Alien 3, and finally a best and worst for Fede Alvarez following Alien Covenant. Once I have finished the review of Romulus, I will then create a ranking video for all the Alien films using the 4 criteria from this video, along with my objective quality ratings so as to bring all of the potential sources of analysis at my disposal to bear on that list. And with that said, that brings me to the end of my review of Ridley Scott's best and worst films. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please smash that like button, and if you are so inclined, drop me a comment to let me know what you think. I am still new to YouTube as well, so any suggestions are much appreciated. So until next time, always remember.
Brothers! What we doing live? Echoes in eternity.